Hi folks, welcome to this video on practice methods. Again, this could be one of the Section B essay topics. When we talk about practice methods, we're talking about how would you set up a session. So let's say you've got 60 minutes, an hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that. How would you set the session up? And there's 4 main ways that we can do practice methods. So we're just going to look at each one in turn and see what we'd do if questions came up on these topics. Okay, so first we've got mass practice. We've always got to give a definition of these terms, so we're telling the examiner exactly that we know exactly what it is. Mass practice is a session with no breaks or intervals. So if you've got an hour-long session, you are working from minute 1 to minute 60. You are not giving your participants, your performers, any breaks or any recovery time in that session. In contrast to that, a distributed practice session is one that has breaks or interval periods. So you'll do drill 1 for 10 minutes, then you'll have a 5-minute break before you move on to drill 2. Varied practice is where you do different drills but on the same skill. So you might be looking at passing in your sport. A varied practice session wouldn't be one where you just do the same passing drill for an hour. You might open with a box drill, just passing to a partner, and then we'll bring in a 2v1 situation where you're having to work against an opponent. We might then bring in a 3v2 situation, and then we might finish with a condition game based on passing. That would be a varied practice session where you're still focusing on the same skill, but you're doing a variety of different drills in order to widen the experience, the playing experience of your participants. And finally, we've got mental rehearsal or mental practice, and that is, as you'd expect, you're doing imagery, you're picturing how you perform this skill or this tactic in your mind, as opposed to doing physical practice. Okay, so you know your massed, your distributed and your varied practice are your physical forms of practice. Mental rehearsal is mentally picturing the practice session or the skill. So we're just going to have a quick look at these one at a time. So with mass practice first, again, just a quick reminder, that is no breaks. We're not doing any breaks in this session. We're working for an hour or an hour and a half non-stop. The question is often, what would influence your decision to use a massed practice session? They could then say something a little bit different. What are the advantages or disadvantages of each? What we've got to do is look at the factors that would influence your decision. And then if that question comes up on advantages and disadvantages, that's going to be your call in the exam to analyse the question and break it down and use these. So let's deal with the reasons or the factors that would influence your decision to use a mass practice session. So firstly, what would be key criteria number 1 for doing a mass practice session? It's got to be autonomous learners, high ability learners, because they've got to be able to cope with the demands of a practice session without any breaks in it. Okay, secondly, it develops high fitness levels doing a mass practice session, a session without any breaks. But also, we could also say, in order to do a mass practice session, you need quite high fitness levels in the first place, or else you're not going to be able to last the session. Mass practice is, again, only really going to be used if we're doing simple skills. Even if you are super fit, even if you have got autonomous learners, you are still going to get tired doing a session without any breaks. And if you get tired, you're going to make mistakes. So it's best to only do mass practice sessions when the skills are relatively simple in the first place to minimise the amount of mistakes that your performers are going to make. Mass practice is also great if you haven't got much time. So it's a very time efficient way to coach. If I've got an hour, we are doing an hour. If I have breaks in there, I could end up wasting 15-20 minutes of that hour on breaks. So if I've got a lot to do in a set amount of time, mass practice, is probably the way forward for that. Finally, really on this, it's only really best to use mass practice when there's relatively low danger in the session that you're doing. As I said, you could be super fit, they could be autonomous, but they are still going to get tired during this session. If you get tired, you start to make mistakes. And as you make mistakes, the danger increases. So we need to really be doing this with low danger or, low risk tasks to start with. So that's what would influence your decision to use a massed practice session. Okay, like I said, if the question came up on advantages and disadvantages, you'd then have to use these ideas to come up with your answer. It's an advantage to use it with autonomous learners, but it's a disadvantage to use with cognitive learners. It's an advantage to use it with simple skills, but it's a disadvantage to use it with complex skills. So we've just got to be able to use these ideas and then apply them to the question that we get. Right then, so in opposition to a mass practice session, we've now got a distributed practice session, and that's a session with breaks. Now, as you might expect, this is kind of going to be the opposite criteria to a mass practice session, and it is. So let's have a look at it. As you might expect now, distributed practice is great for cognitive learners. Okay? They are beginners, so they're going to need regular breaks so they can understand what they've just done, and move on, understand what they're doing next. What do those breaks give cognitive learners? They give them a chance for you to give them feedback, to discuss and Q&A them and see if they have understood everything that they need to understand before they move on to the next drill. Distributed practice sessions are also best for less fit or lower fit individuals, okay? They're a great starting point for people like that. Don't get me wrong, you want to improve their fitness and you'll ultimately try and maybe build up to a mass practice session in some circumstances, but what would influence your decision to set up a distributed practice? It would be if their fitness levels are quite low. As you would expect with a cognitive learner, you would expect them to have quite low fitness levels because they're new to the sport. But you might also want to set up a distributed session if the skill is quite complex. Why? Well, that's going to give you breaks so that you can teach a bit, have a break, and have a discussion with the group. What did you understand by that? Have you got everything that you needed to from that little bit before we then move on to the next one? So that, again, that feedback thing comes into it as well. If it's a complex skill, we can coach it bit by bit and have breaks and intervals to have feedback and have discussions to make sure that we're all making progress and we're all happy with what we're doing. However, as you'd expect, it's quite a time-consuming method. Like I said, if you've got an hour and you're having breaks every 15 minutes, you're going to lose 10-15 minutes of that session to breaks. So you're going to have more time available than what you would to cover the drills. Okay, so it's quite a time-consuming method. And finally then, it's a good session to use if there is potential danger, if there is risk in this session, because you can then control the risk by doing a bit, having a break, make sure everyone recovers, gets over their fatigue, make sure everyone understands what they've done and what they need to do in the next one, and then move it on again. So it's a very, very good method for controlling danger within a session.